The smell hits you before anything
The smell hits you before anything else. Wet wool, horse dung mixed with November mud, the sweat of 400 bodies pressed into a 60-metre corridor that the people of Norwich called the shambles, the chaos. It is market day. It is 1315. And somewhere in that crowd, there is a tax collector named Thomas de Roxom, who is about to have a very, very bad day. Here is the question no medieval history book will ever ask you. How did a group of ordinary women, with no titles, no weapons, no noble protection, systematically control England's greatest wool market for 12 years without anyone managing to arrest them? The answer is buried in the court records of a city that, at that moment, was wealthier than Oxford, busier than Bristol, and completely out of control. And once you learn who was protecting these women, you'll understand why the medieval English legal system had a bug that nobody wanted to fix. The world about to be shattered. To understand what happened in Norwich between 1310 and 1322, you need to understand one thing about medieval English wool. It was oil, not metaphorically. Wool was the commodity that sustained the crown. Edward II financed his wars with taxes on wool exports. The great Flemish merchants, from Bruges, from Ghent, kept resident agents in cities like Norwich specifically to buy wool in bulk. The city produced what contemporary documents called worsted, a combed, finer type of wool, made only in that region of East Anglia, so specific that the name became the name of the fabric itself. It still is to this day. The Norwich wool market ran twice a week in the square before the Guildhall, the courthouse and town hall built in white limestone that still stands today. Travelling vendors arrived the night before. Shepherds brought bales on the backs of oxen from villages 30 kilometres away. And in the middle of all that commercial chaos, fraudulent weighing, false measures, unpaid debts, there was a parallel system of municipal taxation that collectors like Thomas de Roxom had to manage with their bare hands. That was the world the 6 women operated in. And before we introduce them, we need to be honest about what we actually know. The records are fragmentary. Names sometimes appear with different spellings, and medieval history rarely bothered recording ordinary women in any detail. But what survives is enough to build a profile. Agnes de Brunham mentioned 7 times in the rolls between 1311 to 1319. Apparently the group's leader or spokesperson also appears as a witness in 2 debt proceedings, implying she could read contracts. Cecily Lawafera. The surname indicates she sold wafers, waffles and biscuits at the market. A street trader. She knew every corner, every exit, every vendor who owed a debt. Marjorie de Coton, named alongside Agnes in 3 extortion charges. The surname de Coton indicates origin in a village a few kilometres from Norwich, likely a recent migrant. The 3 with no names. The records sometimes list et aliis mulieribus, and other women. 3 appear without individual identification. The court didn't bother recording them, which says everything. But here is what makes no sense. These records show repeated charges, witness evidence, specific names. So why, in 12 years, was not one of these women arrested, fined, or even formally summoned to appear in court? The real facts, in rising order. Let's begin with what the documents actually say. The first collective charge against the group appears in 1311. The language is direct. A group of women, mulieres maleficae, the term the clerks used repeatedly, translatable as evil-doing women, or, in the ecclesiastical usage of the period, women who do harm intentionally. had allegedly stolen wool bales from a merchant of Yarmouth during the fair day. On its own, that would not be unusual. Theft at medieval fairs was endemic. But the records that follow show something different, a pattern. In 1313, Agnes de Brunham and aliis mulieribus are charged with approaching travelling vendors before the official opening of the fair, while stalls were still being erected, and demanding payment in raw wool in exchange for protection from disturbance. The word used in the record is exactio, extortion, the same term the records used to describe corrupt royal officials. In 1315, Thomas de Roxom, the tax collector I mentioned at the opening, files a formal complaint. According to the record, while attempting to collect the stall tax from Cecily le Waffera, he was surrounded by 5 women who shoved him against a pile of bales, tore his record book, and flung his collected coins into the mud. The record uses the verb insult averant. They assaulted, they attacked. Thomas makes no mention of being injured. He also makes no mention of having collected the tax. Now comes the part nobody can explain cleanly. In 1316, Agnes de Brunham appears as a character witness in a debt proceeding involving a textile merchant named Robert de Corston. Robert de Corston was one of the wealthiest men in Norwich, a member of the city council. His name appears in the patent rolls as someone who had received a royal licence to export wool. In other words, a man with direct access to the city's administrative apparatus. Secret fact: the Norwich Borough Court rolls contain a marginal annotation, a detail that escapes almost every reader because it appears in a non-standard Latin abbreviation, indicating that Agnes de Brunham was called as a character witness on behalf of Robert de Corston, not merely as a factual witness. This carries a specific legal implication under English customary law of the period. To serve as a character witness in a borough court, you were required to possess what the records call fama bona, good reputation within the local community. In other words, the very same court that in earlier records had called her a mulieres maleficae accepted Agnes as a person of good standing when she was serving Robert de Corston's interests. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed to protect networks of interest, not to apply justice consistently. The connection between Agnes and Robert de Corston is not explicit in the documents. There is no entry that reads, Robert paid Agnes to protect his interests at the market. But when you read the records in chronological sequence, and most historians do not, because the rolls are split across volumes that have never been fully digitized, the pattern is unsettling. The vendors the women extorted were systematically the competitors of Robert de Corston and his business associates, the Yarmouth merchants, the itinerant traders bringing non-local wool, those who did not pay guild fees, never Robert's partners, never the city council members, never those with access to the formal apparatus of protection. The mulieres maleficae were not a random gang. They were, in all likelihood, a private enforcement service, informal, deniable, and extraordinarily effective. But if they were an instrument of someone powerful, what happened when that someone decided they were no longer needed? The real historical outcome. In 1322, the entries in the borough court rolls simply stop mentioning the group. There is no trial. There is no sentence. There is no note explaining what happened. Agnes de Brunham appears one final time, as an aggrieved party in a rental dispute, not as a defendant. It is the last time the name appears in any surviving record. What happened between 1316 and 1322 is informed historical speculation, not established fact. But the context matters. In 1322, Edward II suffered the catastrophic defeat at Boroughbridge. The English political system convulsed. Many of the great city merchants, especially those with ties to wool export networks, came under financial or political pressure. Robert de Coston, if he was indeed the group's patron, may simply have lost the capacity or the will to maintain that informal network. There are three hypotheses for the silence of the records after 1322. First, the group simply dispersed when the protection was withdrawn. Second, the records from that period were lost or destroyed, which happens frequently with medieval municipal documents. Third, and most sobering, without a patron, the group became vulnerable. And in medieval English law, a woman without a husband, a lord, or a formally recorded bond was nearly invisible, but also nearly defenceless. What the records equally do not show is just as eloquent. No execution, no formally recorded banishment, no confiscation of property. None of them ended up at Tyburn. None was publicly flogged at the pillory in the market square, which was the standard punishment for theft caught in the act during that period, described in the Annales Monastity of Wymondham Abbey for similar cases in the same region. 30 strokes, back turned to the market crowd. They simply vanished from the records, as most low-status medieval women always vanish from the records. But the system that allowed them to operate, that did not vanish. The connection to the present day. Here is what fascinates me about this story. The mechanism that protected Agnes de Brunham and her companions for 12 years was not individual corruption. It was structural, medieval English law, specifically the Frank Pledge system, in which men of the community were collectively accountable for their neighbours' infractions, was designed on the assumption that women depended on male supervision for full legal existence. A married woman was a feme covert, legally subsumed by her husband. A single or widowed woman was a feme soul, with
a married woman was a female covert, legally subsumed by her husband.
Protection.
A single or widow's woman was a female soul.
That same legal gap that made women vulnerable sometimes made them difficult to prosecute, because the court needed a clear, identifiable legal respondent. And if that respondent was a woman with no husband, no lord, no formally registered bond, the process stalled. This is not obscure medieval history. It is the conceptual framework from which our own legal blind spots descend. When a large law firm uses a shell subsidiary to lobby in a regulated sector, technically legal, clearly contrary to the spirit of the law, impossible to prosecute without proving intent, it is operating in exactly the same conceptual space as Agnes de Brunham in 1313. In the gap between what the law prohibits and what it can prove. The difference is that Agnes had no access to $800 an hour lawyers. The question I leave with you: if the legal system was designed with gaps built in, who benefits when those gaps persist for centuries? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you know of similar cases of informal protection in other eras, tell me. Research for the next episode has already begun.